On a typical New Jersey night, where silence was only interrupted by the occasional headlights cutting through the deserted road, an experienced police officer noticed something off-script: an abandoned car. The faint light from his flashlight revealed strange signs, fogged-up windows and scratch marks on the door. If it were just a mechanical failure, the scene wouldn't feel so unsettling. A shiver ran down his spine, that kind of instinct only years on the job could grant. What would unfold there had all the makings of the most unnerving horror stories, brimming with psychological terror. Approaching cautiously, radio in hand, he couldn't avoid the adrenaline rush. Something felt wrong. The surroundings seemed like pure conspiracy. Elongated shadows cast by nearby trees created an atmosphere of suspense worthy of a movie. He knew that, many times, the most subtle details told their own story. He had seen abandoned cars before, but none as disturbing as this one. Every step toward the vehicle felt like an invitation to dive into a narrative that only got worse. Shining his flashlight inside, the officer realized this case was far from ordinary. Disordered items, a shattered glass bottle, and the claustrophobic silence of the surroundings created a scene that screamed danger. This wasn't his first encounter with bizarre cases, but at that moment, the feeling that he was stepping into a chapter worthy of the most twisted horror stories was almost tangible. And that's when he realized, he wasn't alone. As he assessed the car, the officer caught movement in the corner of his eye. A slim figure opened the door on the opposite side and bolted toward the forest. The scene was swift but enough to raise all alarms. The figure seemed determined, almost as if familiar with the terrain. The officer shouted commands for the suspect to stop, but the night silence was his only reply. At that moment, he understood this wouldn't be a simple chase. It felt like stepping into a psychological thriller, where the tension was fed by both the unknown and the surroundings. With his flashlight trembling slightly in his hands, he reached the edge of the woods, hesitating for a moment. That sea of dark trees seemed to whisper danger. Experience told him to wait for backup, but something, perhaps a mix of duty and curiosity, pushed him forward. Every step deeper into the forest felt amplified, as if the setting itself was heightening the fear. He knew that entering the woods at night was to venture into a realm where reason often surrendered to imagination. The pursuit led him further into the darkness, where the flashlight's beam barely helped. The silence was eerie, as though the forest conspired to conceal the fugitive. Finding no clear tracks, he stopped, straining to hear any movement, only to be startled by a more disconcerting realization: there were no footprints, marks, or any physical sign of someone having passed through. The feeling was clear: this wasn't a simple escape but the beginning of a puzzle worthy of the darkest horror stories. Returning to the car, the officer summoned the courage to investigate further. The smell, now unmistakable, signaled something terribly wrong. Opening the trunk, he stumbled upon a scene straight out of the most disturbing horror stories: blood-soaked towels and, among them, something that made his stomach churn: a severed human hand, carefully wrapped in paper. The sight, paired with the suffocating stench of decomposition, turned an already strange scene into a tangible nightmare. His professional instinct demanded calm, but his mind raced. Whose hand was it? How did it end up there? And, most importantly, what had happened to the rest of the body? He immediately radioed headquarters, calling for reinforcements and reporting the gruesome discovery. The tension was palpable, and he knew every minute alone in that macabre scene only amplified the psychological terror. Even the usual night sounds, a cricket or the rustle of leaves, felt magnified, as if nature itself bore witness to something sinister. While waiting for support, the officer couldn't shake the feeling that the car was more than just a crime scene. It was the starting point of a mystery that could branch in countless directions. He searched for additional clues, but everything he found seemed more sinister: small cuts in the upholstery, bloody fingerprints on the glass. The human mind has a cruel habit of filling gaps with the worst scenarios, and there, surrounded by that terrifying atmosphere, he felt the story would only grow darker. The arrival of reinforcements brought a K-9 unit, specialized in tracking, to assist in the search for the suspect. With tracking dogs leading the way, the team ventured into the forest, relying on the animal's ability to find any human trace. However, despite the tension-filled atmosphere, the search yielded only frustration. No tracks, no footprints. It was as if the suspect had vanished. The forest, already reminiscent of horror stories, now felt like an accomplice, concealing every trace of evidence. What was most unsettling was the absence of blood trails, even with the severed hand found in the car. Something didn't add up. Logic dictated there should be clear signs, but reality mocked that expectation. The dogs, usually unbeatable at finding trails, seemed confused, circling aimlessly. The group, which began the operation with determination, now felt an increasing discomfort, as if the forest was toying with their minds. Psychological terror took shape, not just from the mystery but from the feeling of being watched. After hours of fruitless searching, the team had to retreat. The forest's silence seemed to mock their failure, while their flashlights illuminated only emptiness. Among the officers, a mix of frustration and unease took hold. It wasn't just the suspect's disappearance that troubled them, but the lack of explanations. The case began to feel like something far greater, as though layers of secrets awaited those brave enough to uncover them. In the following days, the vehicle underwent a thorough investigation. Expectations were high: fingerprints, DNA traces, anything that could identify the suspect. But the results were disheartening. The car was stolen, complicating the search for its rightful owner. Worse, the fingerprints and DNA found inside didn't match anyone in the database. The investigation, already resembling a horror story, now took on an even more surreal dimension. With no concrete answers, detectives began considering other possibilities. Could the suspect be someone living on the fringes of society, a social ghost with no legal traces? Or perhaps someone deliberately erased from the system, as if wanting to vanish completely? The narrative increasingly felt like an exercise in psychological terror, where the true enemy was the void left by unanswered questions. Investigators found themselves sinking into a case that seemed to grow more complex with every new detail. Over time, the case was shelved but never forgotten. Horror stories surrounding the episode began to circulate among the police force, with speculations ranging from secret cults to serial killers. For the officer who started it all, the mystery continued to throb in his memory. How could someone disappear so completely, taking with them the key to such a disturbing crime? Perhaps, just perhaps, the answer still lies hidden in that forest, waiting for someone brave enough to face the unknown. During a night patrol, the officers followed the electronic ankle monitor signal of Camille to a remote area of the county. The last known location led them to a house that seemed straight out of horror stories, with its neglected appearance and evident isolation. As they parked their car, a sense of unease began to fill the air, as if the environment itself was trying to repel their presence. The headlights illuminated a worn-out facade, with broken windows and a door that seemed like it hadn't been opened properly in years. This promised to be more than just a routine search. As they approached, the officers noticed an unsettling silence in the area. Even the typical nighttime sounds of insects, so common in that region, seemed absent. They exchanged cautious glances, aware that seemingly simple situations could quickly escalate into something far more complicated. It wasn't their first time entering suspicious houses, but something about this one provoked an unusual sense of unease. The feeling was almost tangible, as if the house itself was watching them. With weapons drawn and flashlights on, the officers knocked on the door, announcing their presence. The sound echoed through the structure, but no immediate movement responded. For a moment, the silence seemed to scream until the door slowly creaked open. What awaited them inside defied any expectation, introducing a sequence of events ready to plunge them into a scenario worthy of psychological terror. As the officers entered the house, they were immediately struck by a dense and oppressive atmosphere. The only light came from a dim bulb in the living room, casting shadows that seemed to dance on the worn walls. There were no electronics, modern furniture, or any sign of recent technology, just an environment frozen in time. It was as if every room had been carefully stripped of anything that could offer comfort or familiarity. This first impression made every step echo like a warning in the silence. The space had a peculiar quality, something that played with the senses. As they moved through the rooms, there was a strange sensation that the dimensions were shifting. A hallway that seemed short suddenly appeared longer, doors that had been opened seemed to close on their own, without wind or explanation. It was a spatial confusion that made even the most experienced among them hesitate. It felt almost as if the house had a will of its own, a setting worthy of the most unsettling horror stories. Despite the growing discomfort, the officers knew they had to continue. Each room they searched seemed as empty as the last, but the tension only grew. Everything felt carefully designed to disorient them, as if the house was more of a mental maze than a physical one. Deep down, they knew that something more awaited them, something they hadn't yet fully grasped but was beginning to reveal itself in the small, eerie details. As the officers continued their search, a figure appeared at the end of the hallway, a disheveled woman exhibiting unsettling behavior. She moved strangely, almost crawling, and repeatedly screamed for Camille. Her voice echoed through the house, amplifying the discomfort. It was impossible to ignore her vacant stare and the disturbed expression she wore, as if she were trapped in a trance between fear and delirium. The officers exchanged cautious glances, sensing that something very wrong was unfolding. When questioned, the woman seemed incapable of providing coherent answers. Between screams and mutterings, she mentioned Camille as if the girl were present, hiding in some obscure corner of the house. Her presence added a layer of psychological terror to the situation, as if she were both a victim and part of the mystery. At times, she would stop abruptly, staring at the officers with an intensity that made even the most seasoned among them hesitate. It was as if her erratic movements reflected the disjointed nature of the environment itself. Despite the woman's disturbing behavior, the officers knew they had to proceed cautiously. Her presence seemed both a clue and a distraction. Every gesture she made seemed loaded with meaning, though incomprehensible, as if she were trying to communicate something beyond words. It was impossible not to feel that the mystery of the house, Camille, and this woman were intrinsically connected, waiting to reveal a conclusion that promised to be even darker. As the officers began to search the house, they noticed something deeply strange. Every time they left a room, it seemed they entered a different place. The environment appeared to transform before their eyes, with hallways appearing where walls had been and doors leading to disconnected spaces. This spatial distortion made every step uncertain, as if they were walking inside a living puzzle. It was a mental game that grew more suffocating by the minute, as though the house were alive, manipulating their movements. On the second floor, their search led them to a sealed door. With combined effort, they managed to open it, revealing an empty attic exuding a heavy atmosphere. The wall's insulation was visibly old, and the only light came from a single hanging bulb that swayed slightly. There were no furniture or objects, only the echo of emptiness pressing down on the officers. The space seemed to harbor a secret that refused to be revealed, a detail that heightened the psychological terror of the experience. Meanwhile, the woman, who had previously been screaming for Camille, remained seated at the base of the stairs, silent and motionless but watching everything. Her eyes followed the officers' every movement, and her presence was as unsettling as the house itself. From time to time, she let out a sudden scream, resuming her call for Camille, as if trapped in a cycle of despair. Despite their exhaustive search, no concrete sign of the girl was found, leaving the officers caught in a web of doubts and an increasing sense that they were dealing with something far beyond understanding. Even after leaving the house, the officers couldn't shake the feeling that something inexplicable had occurred. Days passed, but the case continued to haunt them, not just because of Camille's absence, but because it seemed to break the very rules of reality. Reports were filed, further investigations conducted, but nothing about the place, the woman, or the time discrepancy made sense. The house lingered in their memories as a portal to something incomprehensible, a break in the fabric of rationality. Individually, the officers began to notice subtle residual effects. One, for instance, reported having vivid dreams about the house's corridors, while another claimed to occasionally feel time slowing down during certain moments of the day. A third officer returned to the site days later, only to find the house had vanished entirely, leaving nothing but an empty lot and no explanation. This discovery cemented the mystery in a limbo, defying any attempt at resolution. In the end, the case was closed, but it left lasting marks on the team. What they experienced wasn't just an event but an invitation to question everything they thought they knew about time, space, and the human mind. Some might call it a paranormal phenomenon, others, a case of psychological terror. But for those who were there, one certainty remained: that house held secrets that weren't meant to be uncovered, and perhaps it was better that way. After all,